Good morning, women of welcome. How are we? I mean, it's probably afternoon where you're at. Sorry, I always say that in Colorado, like good morning. And it's, I realize it's 10:15. But, after you get all the kids off and all the things to school, and then you forget that you were supposed to bring them something, it just feels like I'm starting the morning. Hey, ladies, I'm so glad you're here. So glad you're here. We are going to be talking really quickly here in a minute with Dr. Christina Crenshaw. But she went with us to the US-Mexico border. We're going to talk about that. So she'll be hopping on here in just a second, as soon as all of the technology starts to work. Here she is. Hey, Brad.
Hey, it worked. It's been like a year since I've done a live, and I'd kind of forgotten how to push all the buttons.
I'm telling you, us elder millennials, we just make it look difficult. It just has to be difficult for us. I don't know.
Well,
hey, everybody hopping on.
Yeah, they keep changing all of the different buttons too. You can't do that.
I just start
40
to feel old, and then the Super Bowl made me feel really old, and so here we are, but we're just making it happen. So good to see you, friend.
Yeah, good to see you too. How's the weather in Colorado?
Oh, I really can't complain. Colorado's just kind of, I mean, you have to like snow.
Yeah.
But we get sun with snow. So, it works out. And I'm sure Texas is just fabulous per usual.
Well, yeah, this is our winter season, but it does feel a little bit like the spring.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Hey, everybody. Okay, we are going to be talking with Dr. Christina Crenshaw. And Christina went with us to the Texas-Mexico border a couple years ago, right? Or a year ago, maybe?
Yeah. I think it was summer 2022. Yeah. So like a year and a half ago.
Yikes. Yeah. Okay.
I know.
So
it's fast.
We have not had this discussion, but we have these conversations with people when they come back from the border. It's part of our kind of back from the border series. And for someone who lives in Texas and was invited to go to the border, I guess my big question to you is, why did you say yes to going to the border with us?
Yeah. Well, first I'll kind of back up a little bit and like Bree, I'm loving your book. I'm like taking notes.
Look
I
at
got
you
lots of questions.
sticky notes.
No,
That's
really
awesome.
good. Yeah. So everyone who has not yet bought the book, go out and buy it because it's just really good, and I love the way that you're using scripture to support your position. So great job. I'm enjoying it. But why did I say yes? So I think I have had a history of doing border work, but it was from a different perspective than where you guys were coming from with Women of Welcome. And so that was intriguing to me. I wanted to be challenged in what I thought I knew to be true. I wanted to hear, I'm hesitant to even call it the other side because like we're on the same side of the kingdom, right? It's like we have so much in common. But I had probably about 10 years of work with anti-trafficking organizations. And so what I knew of the border had only been this perspective of we need to make sure that we gatekeep because we have all this nefarious activity, human trafficking and drug smuggling coming across the border. And so I don't think I had realized that those narratives had subconsciously built up this resistance to actually the people who were involved, that I was more looking at this strictly from a policy perspective, and policy is good. And it's like one of the things I want to talk about, like we need policy, we need rules, we need structure. But I think that I had unintentionally missed the people in that. Or sometimes when I thought, okay, well, these policies are meant to protect people coming across, particularly children being trafficked or women being trafficked. But I think that I had lost that place of, but what does it look like for the individual? Like sometimes when we fly so high at the macro level, we miss that micro right in front of us. And so that was compelling. I wanted to go with a faith-based organization that I knew loved Jesus, that I knew was unapologetic about that, and who could also present but hey, have you thought about this perspective, which is what I walked away from. I walked away with a lot of what I thought to be true, to be challenged, even if my views weren't radically changed. And in your book, you talk about that. Like, my hope is that by the time you finish this book, you aren't standing in the exact same place that you were when you came to the book. And that really was what the border trip, the immersion trip was for me.
Well, and I think You're right. I mean, we start to talk about, everyone thinks immigration is just solely a political issue. And what that really means is it's a partisan issue and everybody's got a side that they're on. And yet, if we were to really take off that, kind of like empire mindset and put that to the side, put the partisan politics to the side, and really put on this kingdom mindset of, okay, if we're all made in the image and likeness of God, what does it look like to love my neighbor and to do that well? So, I think people are surprised when we say we don't want to talk about partisan politics. We want to talk about people. Politics are part of it. We have to, because engaging in politics in a healthy way helps people flourish. And that's why I think people are a little bit like shocked when we say at Women of Welcome, we want safe and secure borders for people on both sides of the fence line. But we also want compassionate treatment of people who are made in the image and likeness of God, because safe and secure borders, good laws, a functioning immigration system actually provides flourishing for people on both sides of the border. So I think people are a little bit surprised when they hear that. So I'm wondering, when you went to the border, you went with us to El Paso and Juarez. What was the thing that still has stayed with you from that trip, that maybe when someone says, oh, didn't you go? Is there something that you're like, this is the story I tell?
Yeah, I don't know, Brie, if I could narrow it down to just one, but here are the top two that come to mind. So the first was, so I'll kind of start with like more of like a rational and then like kind of the emotional side too. I think doing the border museum tour and learning that we have had Border Patrol for 100 years, like literally 100 years in 2024, and then realizing we have had Republican presidents, we've had Democratic presidents in that 100-year time frame, and that this has been a broken system. Like it's a two-party problem, that the Republicans can't just blame it on the Democrats and the Democrats can't just blame it on the Republicans, and Texas can't just blame it on the rest of the country, because this has been 100-year-old problem that really needs, like, we need to pause and we need to address it and we need to get solutions. And that's not to say that we haven't tried. I remember learning about what Reagan did for the border, and different presidents have tried. But I think that holistic picture of like, wait a second, we didn't just wake up in 2020 and realize that we have a problem. This has been a growing, mounting problem that neither party has sufficiently addressed. So I think that helped me realize, like, oh, these party narratives, they no longer, they aren't helpful, and they no longer hold water because they're both complicit, right? And so I think that was really helpful perspective. When you're only getting one side of the story, sometimes it's easy to demonize the other until you realize, oh, you're both complicit here.
Yeah.
So that was one takeaway. And then I think the other was just actually meeting the different women and children who have fled, particularly, where we were working, different South American countries, and you realize how arduous their journey is. And it just, as well, as a human being, but I'm getting teary-eyed now, but thinking just like as a mother, I mean, motherhood is hard enough as it is in a first world country. Like today, you were joking, like I forgot I had to get Valentine's for my kids, so it's like this motherhood, like never ending responsibility. And I can't imagine taking that on the road. I can't imagine walking across countries, and trusting my children to people who probably don't have their best interest in mind. And you and I both know the data and the stats on how many women and children are sexually exploited along the journey. So I think actually putting a face with the story elicited so much compassion. It doesn't change, again, like as you address, that we need some macro perspective. When you engage, though, at that human level, it's no longer just a political talking point. This is an actual person, and this person needs help and a solution. And so I think just humanizing that, being up close and meeting these women and meeting their children and listening to their journeys, you walk away with a deeper sense of compassion.
One of my favorite stories from that trip that we took, and we were visiting a maternity shelter for women and children that had actually never been visited by Americans before. Mm-hmm. And we were the first ones. I don't even know if you knew that, but I think I mentioned that we were the first Americans that were ever allowed in that shelter. And it was just for women and children, or women who were pregnant. And so it's just a really special shelter that we got to go into. And when we went in there, we played a game with some of the women. We played Mexican bingo and we played water balloons with the kids outside just to like provide some laughter and some joy and also just to be present with them. I think sometimes people are like, why do you even take these trips? You know, they're not service trips, they're not mission trips. And the whole point of the trip is to get in close proximity to people and to show Christ-like welcome and walk in really hard footsteps that other people have had to take that you would probably never likely have to take. And one of my favorite stories from that shelter visit was that, you know, usually when we go to Mexico, there are some women who have some Spanish speaking skills. And so they try and use those Spanish speaking skills. And it always comes out a little, you know, like no one has, you know, to usted, el, like everybody's a little bit messy about it. And I just remember we're all kind of like standing up and sharing who we met and where they're from and just trying to have a little dialogue. And granted, remember, we're the first Americans that have come to this shelter to be with these women. And one gal from our group, Jenny, stands up and she starts talking. And I'm like, her Spanish is terrible. I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, this is bad. But I'm just smiling and I'm like, you know what? She's trying. And come to find out, I'm like, she's not speaking Spanish. She's speaking Creole. And we didn't like know anything about this group. They knew nothing about us. And it just so happened that God had paired Jenny with another gal who had fled from Haiti, who only spoke Creole. And she'd been in the shelter for 3 months and no one had been able to speak her language. And Jenny had adopted several kids from Haiti and had spent several years in Haiti. And so she was fluent in Creole. And we were all just like in shock because what God had done. He had brought these two women together. And she was like, no one's been able to talk to me for 3 months in this shelter since I arrived. And our group was the first to be able to bring American and Christ-like welcome into this space. And I remember as we were kind of standing in the circle and sharing, one of the ladies said, thank you for coming to be with us and just be family with us for even just a little bit. And I thought that that was so powerful because it just really, like you said, it humanizes those who are on the outside looking in. And I don't know, did you have a big takeaway from that shelter visit? You were very observant during that time, I remember.
Yeah, well, I don't speak Spanish and I don't speak Creole, so I definitely had a language barrier. But I loved that they trusted us to love on their kids. You know, like just like there was a little girl who like came up and sat in my lap and wanted to do bingo with me, and then playing outside with the water balloons, and just that opportunity. Like you realize in those moments that I have nothing in myself to give except Jesus. And if I can sit here and exude Jesus, which is probably what that Creole woman felt, that the Haitian woman who spoke in a Creole language from Jenny, is that she was like, I feel loved, I feel seen. It's a way of just bringing Jesus to people. And I wish that I had, I'm sure you share these sentiments too, the ability to change systems or to make government listen or to implement policies. But there's a beauty too in that, like, all I have to give you is Jesus. Like, yes, donations, and yes, keep working. But at the end of the day, if we're not giving people someone who points them to eternal life and eternal joy and eternal fulfillment, then we're missing what their soul needs first and foremost. And you guys talked a great deal about this of Women in Welcome. A lot of these women have faith. Some of them are coming and they have a robust faith and they know the Lord. So this isn't really just about evangelizing, but it's about just being with them. Like, I just want to help alleviate any hurt, and it's not anything I can do. It's what Jesus has done through me and what I'm praying the Holy Spirit does here too. And so I think that was just a fresh reminder of, I don't have the answers, but I have Jesus. And whatever that looks like let's find him in this moment and this hurt. So I don't know, it was like a Holy Spirit moment when Jenny was able to connect with that woman. And I think that's what being in the shelter was for me. We had a lot of trainings, and those were really helpful too. I thought, like learning from World Relief. I'm like forgetting the fourth one, but I remember learning that people typically come, and so you can talk about this. You talk about this in the book, but by four ways: blood, sweat, tears, and then what's the fourth one? And you can kind of unpack
Luck.
that. Luck. Okay, that's right, like lottery system. So blood, sweat, tears, and then luck. I couldn't remember the fourth. Do you want to tell people, because you talk about this in your book too, like what historically have been the ways that people, and I think this speaks to like the system's kind of broken. We've got to reevaluate this. But tell people who may not know, like, what are the four ways people typically get to the US?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody, and what I want to just make very, very clear is that Women of Welcome is for legal immigration. We are not encouragers of illegal immigration. In general, we think that it should be harder for people to immigrate illegally, and actually easier, more efficient for people to come through legal pathways. And so I think, again, with that context, I think people their shoulders start to kind of like relax a little bit, like, okay, you want safe and secure borders like I do. You also want people to come legally like I do, So it's like once we have that kind of foundation of like, Christ-like welcome does not mean open borders. Christ-like welcome is a posture. It's not a policy. Mm-hmm. And so once we start to think about how our compassion is not actually political, it's meant to be prophetic in really painful places, I think that actually starts to churn our heart in some kind of new and curious direction about how would God have me show up in this place. And so I think with that context, I think people are always like, just get in line. Mm-hmm. And when you think about what lines there are for people to get, you realize how broken the system is and how we're seeing the issue at the border as a crisis instead of an opportunity. And I mean an opportunity like for the American economy, and also an opportunity for the gospel and the American church, because there are so many people from around the world, the nations that we have been sending people to constantly to go reach on people groups are showing up at our doorstep. And we're saying, no, we don't want you here. We want to meet you over there. Mm-hmm. We don't necessarily want to meet you here. And I think that's probably the hardest part. It's like when we went to that shelter, there was just so much pain. There was a woman who said, just broke down in tears. She said, thank you for coming to see us. And then she just broke down and she said, I'm so sorry that I stepped on your territory. That's what she said.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah. And in that moment, you're like, you should never have to apologize for trying to provide for your children. I'm sorry. I'm ashamed that we don't have a pathway for you, And again, with the context of not everybody coming to the border should be allowed in, and not everybody who's coming is a woman or a child. And not everybody coming who's applying for asylum right now is actually going to qualify. So all of those things in context, right? But there's really just four lanes, and that is that it's blood. You come through your family. Right now, that line is about 10 to 15 years long, and it costs about $15,000. So that's not really an efficient line to get into, especially if you're fleeing persecution or if you cannot feed your family. That line is not going to be the line for you. And if you don't know anybody in the US, like a lot of these other countries, I mean, immigration really just used to be from Mexico. And like everything about our system in the 80s and 90s was built for single adult males who were coming for economic opportunities. And those who had crossed illegally, we'd put them in detention centers. But now we see at least 50% being families that are coming. And so we're just not geared for that kind of switch. Yeah. And they're coming for safety, they're coming for economic reasons and those things, but it's different than what it was in the 80s and 90s. So you have the blood, the family. So that's one avenue that's not immediate and very difficult and broken. You have sweat, so you could come and work through a visa program. Our visas are actually so limited. Our economic visas, our work visas, our ag visas, they're very seasonal and they're very limited. And a lot of those visas are actually reserved for high skilled workers, meaning that you have a company who's going to sponsor you to come because you have a higher education or skill set that you're coming to provide for the US. So there are ag visas that are swallowed up in minutes. But if you know any farmers, if you know any ag workers, they are desperate for workers. And actually having more agricultural visas would bring down inflation. It would boost our economy. And that's not a path to citizenship. That's a path for flourishing for people, you know, if they have an economic or an ag visa of some sort. So those are really reserved for high skill workers. So that line really doesn't apply. And then you have blood, sweat, tears. That's the asylum process that we see so many people coming to. And I think what people don't realize is that seeking asylum, you have to be in the country in which you are requesting asylum from. So you actually, it is the legal way to seek asylum or to start an asylum application, to either be at a port of entry at that country or to be in between ports of entry. But you have to be on US soil. So what you see hundreds of thousands of people fleeing what they feel is persecution. And some of it is, and some of it's just economic hardship, right? And they're not going to qualify and they're going to get deported or repatriated, unfortunately for them. But, you know, that's the other avenue. It's asylum. So not everybody coming and saying, I'm fleeing persecution is going to qualify in that. And so that's the third one. And then the fourth one is just luck. There's a diversity lottery that we have that holds a certain number of slots for certain countries and different people and underrepresented people groups. So there's not really this like, hey, just get in line. We're processing people and vetting them as fast as we can. That's just really not how it works. So it's a frustrating thing to remember, like to think about and be like, wow, I didn't know that.
And I don't think the average citizen knows that, because even with my work with doing anti-trafficking, I felt like I had at least a cursory understanding of the border in that sense. I didn't know how difficult it is to legally come. And so again, to reiterate what you said, Women of Welcome is never advocating for illegal immigration, but I think it elicits compassion when you stop to realize, oh, it's actually a lot harder to come legally than we are willing to have the conversation. So when we say like, just get in line, no one is saying, and that line might be a 10-year process, or that, you know, your legal pathways are so very limited. And so again, I'm not a policy person. I don't have a solution, but I recognize that there is a problem, that if we're telling people you need to come legally, then we need to make more legal avenues. We've got to get a better system. And so again, I think that was like a big takeaway, learning World Relief spell out, well, let's talk about how challenging this is, or let's talk about how COVID 2020 impacted the global economy. I think seeing those demographic shifts, you know, like when we closed down, this is what happened to manufacturing over here, and this is what happened. And so you realize how displaced the world is. Again, I don't have a solution for like solving world hunger and poverty, but I at least better see the problem. And so it brings more compassion. So, you know, I don't think that it's Women of Welcome's job. It's not the individual person's job. It's not even the church's job to like figure out all the policy. But I think the question that Women of Welcome poses is, but when they are here, when the mother is standing on your doorstep, when she is in your community, what are you going to do? And it's a whole different question than like, how do we fix immigration?
Yeah.
How do we make it more legal? Like, I don't know. But what I do know is when I see a woman in a shelter here in Texas with her children struggling to make it, or as you talk about, you know, like you talk about Maria and some other women who were like mothers as children. I mean, wasn't one of them like 14 and she had an 8-month-old on her hip, and
11 and 13.
right. And so, you know, it's that place of like, okay, the politics of this aside, when they're here, what does that look like to engage and to love and to rally the church and support? And so I think that too alleviates a lot of the, you don't have to pick a political side. You don't have to find the solutions. We're just asking you that, you know, when they're here, what will your response be? And in a way, it's similar to what we do with homelessness. Like, I don't have an answer to, all of the homeless crisis or the opioid crisis. But when you encounter that person, what is your heart? How do you engage? And how do you stay soft? Because that really is the Christ-like response. And so I think, the holistically, what the trip did for me is that it reminded me to stay soft, stay compassionate. That these are people, not just a political talking point.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people are, who don't live in a border state are like, I'm not exactly sure what I can do. I feel so far away from the issue. And yet we know the immigrants are everywhere in this country, from being resettled to maybe even being bused places. And I mean, I think the reality is, for those that, especially for those who are in Texas, and you're seeing, just the constant hoopla around all that is happening with, Operation Lone Star and the busing and all of these things. I think what we have to realize in that is that we are meeting a humanitarian crisis with a military response. And it's so mismatched because we are further harming people in the process. And then we end up using people as political pawns instead of treating them like image bearers. And like you're saying, as far as like, if they're here, what is Jesus's call to us? It's a call to get close. It's a call to minister. It's a call to feed the hungry and clothe the naked and visit those who, are in prison. All these things. It's the Matthew 25:31 through 46. And it's also good for us to remember that so many of these people that are coming, and are being processed by Border Patrol and having initial vetting by Border Patrol, which is great. They are coming from really desperate situations, and whether or not they qualify, so many of them are not going to qualify because they're here for economic reasons. And our asylum system, our asylum pathway, is really just for those who are under the definition of persecution, which is a very narrow and very specific definition. So the reality is, so many of these families that are in our communities right now, they're not going to be with us for a long time, and they are going to be repatriated. They are going to be deported. So many of them, Border Patrol expelled over 300,000 people just in the last year. So I, I think while they're here, like you said, what does Christ-like welcome, what does American welcome look like to hurting people who are likely just in our midst for a little bit? And then those who have suffered persecution and are here, and they will get to stay, and they will get temporary status or something, or a pathway to citizenship. What does it look like to show up well for those who look very different and are probably going to be living in different neighborhoods and different communities? What does it look like to intentionally get close to those people so that they feel the love of Christ and that they take advantage of that opportunity of the nations coming to us?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, yeah, Brina, you and I have talked about this. Like, we talked about it on the trip, and I had it on the DTS. We did a webinar on kind of like biblical justice and human flourishing. Um, and so I think it's complicated, right? Like, when we're talking about the church's role and the government's role. And I think for me, the place where I just have to, like, kind of almost like fly above that conversation
Yeah.
and just say, like, I don't have to have those solutions. My responsibility for the Lord is, what did I do as far as it is with me? Or going back to that Matthew 25, like, this is what I have to offer. Did I steward that well unto the kingdom? The way that I've just had to learn to engage any kind of conversation where it's we're talking biblical justice and social justice, those kind of back and forth is, but what is my biblical responsibility here? Like, the government can figure out how it wants to, like, integrate faith or not, or deal with all of those kinds of conversations. It's just like way above my pay grade. What I know that I'm responsible for is, what did I do before the Lord? And that may look a little different for everybody. Some people have a lot more money to give. Some people, a friend of mine here in Waco is a Spanish speaker, and she's a doctor. And so she took in refugee kids. They would have, one kid at a time for like 3 months before they were able to resettle them with family in the US. But seeing them use their resources and their ability to speak the language and to graft them into their home, even if it was just 3 months of respite for these kids, Again, it makes me kind of teary-eyed to think about, because some of the stories that she would tell us of their exploitation along the way of getting there, or I think like one of the kids that she had never seen running water, and he didn't know what a pool was. You know, they have a pool in their backyard. And so just like these little things that you take for granted at and you realize, okay, it's not about the pool. It's not about the running water. It's about giving these kids a semblance of normalcy and a place of rest and love that they may have not experienced in a long time, if ever, because of their displacement. And I mean, I think that like once they left her home, it's like it's relationships over, which was like so hard for them to have to grieve that process. So it's a sacrifice on their end, but I think that they can legitimately stand before the Lord and say, we stewarded well what we were able to do and to help, and the rest is in your hands, Lord. And I think that that is like the posture we got to take as the church. Like, I don't have to fix all this.
Right.
What role can I play in order to alleviate someone's pain? Is what it just kind of comes down to for me.
Yeah, and I love that. So to me, there are a lot of people, a lot of Christians, if we're speaking specifically to Christians, there are a lot of Christians who are a bit like a wallflower in this conversation because the conversation is intimidating. And not, there's not a lot of people who know how to have this conversation well. And what we're talking about is we're talking about people, not necessarily politics. And so, what would be your encouragement to someone who is on the outside looking in and they're like, I'm curious, but I don't know I don't know what you're talking about necessarily. What would you say to someone who's just kind of on the outside looking in?
Yeah, I think it is helpful when you start from the place of like, we're not advocating for anyone to break any laws. We are just advocating that the government work on getting some better ones or enforce the ones they have, or just kind of that place of what we're here to do is to address the hurt and to address the pain and to love on the people who are here the way that we feel there's a biblical precedence for doing. And I think that diffuses the like it's not our responsibility, I mean, to figure this out. It's really just our responsibility. How are we going to love well when they're here? If they're in the shelters, are we offering, programs for their kids? Are we offering food if we have extra room and we have extra resources? So I think that it's helpful. It was helpful for me to realize, okay, we're not here to figure out what the government should have figured out for 100 years, because that's on them. And I'm also a little indignant. I'm frustrated with America for that. I'm kind of like, come on, guys, let's get this together. But the place where I can serve, and I think understanding that that's just what Women of Welcome is asking. Like, where can you help? How can you serve? How can you love? Let's just do that for the person in front of us. Then it takes away the political narratives, because politics can be so divisive. And so when you're like, this isn't really about politics, this is just how do we love the person in front of us? How do we do that? And then you're like, okay, who doesn't want to do that? You got to be a real monster to like not want to love the person in front of you. And so to that person, I don't know what I would say, but I think just reminding people like, no, we're really here to care for the soul of the person in front of us. How do we do that? You're like, okay, how do we do that? Everybody else can work out their own stuff. How do we do that? I think it's
What
just a
is the Christian
conversation.
response? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a conversation starter rather than like something that just shuts it down. Yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully, if you are curious and you want to know more or you want to look into more, Women of Welcome has a brand new resource this spring. It's called Start with Welcome. And we would love for you to have a conversation with your friends about this book because the book is actually a conversation piece for you in your own home. To sit in a chair with whatever drink you like and to have a conversation really just in this subject matter with this book. And hopefully that's how it comes across and that's how it feels. I don't know. What do you think, Christina?
Yeah. So full disclosure, I'm just over halfway through, but I love, like, it's really helpful as I'm taking notes. I realized pretty early on, I'm like, oh, well, she's asking questions at the end. So you have these discussion questions at the end. So that would probably be helpful for your audience to know, or anybody who goes back to watch this, that if people want to do this in like a book study, Yeah,
Yeah.
small group, some sort of like a book study. And I appreciate that your target audience is people of faith. So you're not trying to address this from, like a secular humanistic perspective. Like, we're unapologetically Jesus loving. So we're just asking the question, like, how would the Lord have us respond to this humanitarian crisis? I love that in here you weave in a lot of your own story. I don't know, I'm sure you've shared this many different times, but just like your own journey of you have always done pro-life work. And then when you had your own immersion trip, wasn't it in Oaxaca, Mexico?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, am I
Oh,
saying that
yeah.
correctly?
Oaxaca.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The OX,
Yeah.
Oaxaca, Mexico, the
Oaxaca.
U,
Oaxaca. Like you said
Oaxaca,
it,
the
and then I was
W.
like, now I don't know how to say it. It's Oaxaca.
Which our church has a church plant there, so I should probably like learn how to pronounce that correctly. But when you're in Oaxaca, you had an encounter. I mean, like a Holy Spirit encounter where you realized, okay, my lens for what constitutes pro-life have been so narrow, and pro-life really is believing in human flourishing from the time a life is in the womb until to grave, womb to tomb. And so I appreciate that perspective, you bringing in the journey of how did you get here? How did we get here? Those sorts of questions. The way that you make a biblical case for how Jesus loved other people well, I think has been really helpful. And then I'm trying to think, yeah, just you ask a lot of great questions, like what is the role of the church? What's the role of the state? Or some of the things that I wrote down. What was your favorite part in writing this? Like you say at the very beginning, I hope by the time you end this book that you're not standing in the same place. What did you hope women would take away reading the book?
Well, I was hopeful that anybody who was curious enough about the topic would pick up the book to have their own first conversation about it and have an easy-ish conversation about a really hard topic from a biblical perspective. And not that we don't mention some policies that are in there, some public policies that are in there, but we're not necessarily talking about partisan politics, which is where we want to rise above, right? We have a role to play in creating just and humane laws that, account for the flourishing of as many people as possible. But the book is really just meant to be a conversation and to say, all right, what does the Bible say about immigrants and refugees? We know the Bible has nothing to say about U.S. immigration policy, just like it doesn't have anything to say about any other country's immigration policy. But it does have a heck of a lot to say about immigrants and refugees from the Old Testament all the way through the New. And so revisiting scriptures that we, the church, have just memorized since childhood and just kind of taken for granted, as far as like, I never thought about Abram being a migrant. I never thought about the Ruth and Boaz story is about being, Ruth and Naomi is about being immigrants and migrants. And then marriage brought about flourishing. And you just like, you look at new stories, you look at stories with new and fresh eyes. And so it's not about reinterpreting scripture. It's about giving scripture like oxygen to breathe beyond what we've typically given it room to address. And that's what I hope. I hope that people are curious enough to have a conversation. And that's what the book is meant to be. It's just meant to be a conversation from a biblical perspective.
Yeah. And I think it's really helpful that you do provide the questions at the end of each chapter. So like one of the chapters, the last one that I left off on, why do people come and what does it look like to have a Christ-like welcome? I think those are really helpful to have the discussion questions at the end after reading. So if anyone wanted to pick this up as a book study, in a group, that would be really helpful. I'm trying to think. So some of the things that I wrote down, we talked a little bit about how do people get here and the different pathways to immigration and how it's a pretty broken system. Do you have, like, if you were going to offer, like, what would one hope be for you that, in all of this conversation, and I haven't followed it closely, but with the border crisis right now, and, Texas is in the thick of it, and I don't always agree with how we address it. I have no power there, but again, like my role as a Christian is very different than my role as, a Texas citizen. I have very limited power there, but I have a lot of influence with how I steward what God has given me. But if you were to say like an encouragement to the church, a solution where you felt like the average person could do this? What do you feel like has been the most helpful with this conversation and this? I'm hesitant to call it a social issue because that takes away from the humanity. But what would you say is like, hey, this is something that like we really could use more help with, or the church could
Yeah,
do?
I think there's two things. I think the first one is using your voice well.
Yeah.
So many Christians feel like it is their obligation to defend so much of the faith instead of actually using your voice to bring about grace and truth at the same time. And that holding tension is what we're supposed to do. We're actually made to kind of be in messy and hard spaces as Christians. Like, this is how God designed us and our faith. And so I think the way we talk about people is really reflective of what we believe about God and what God says about other people. And so if we can't talk about people and humanize people and affirm their dignity, then we've got something we've got to take back to the Lord and say, all right, I need some help in this area, because I am not speaking about image bearers that you created, that you love just as much as me and are as valuable to you as I am to you. If I can't talk about them in humanizing and dignified ways, something's a little broken in my own heart. And that's something you have to just kind of deal with the Lord. So I think I'd love for the church to start dignifying their conversations about this vulnerable populations in a fresh way, in a faith-filled way, and one that holds the tension of what we were talking about before. Just like, yes, you can have safe and secure borders and also humane treatment of people. And these things are not mutually exclusive concepts. And it does, just because you say immigrants are made in the image of God does not mean that you are for open borders. It does not mean that you're not for thorough vetting. It doesn't. So saying these truths does not mean that you're saying other things. It just means the truth that you're saying. And so I wish the church would speak more consistently to affirming the humanity of image bearers. I think the second thing is so using your voice well. And in doing so, I also think, our elected officials are responsible to us. It's our job to hold them accountable. Whether you're a Christian or not, it's your job to hold your elected officials accountable because you elected them. So, we've talked about this a lot at Women of Welcome, but just about how your vote is really going to be imperfect. And so no matter how you vote, whatever way that is, it is your job to use your voice well in the years in between. So if your candidate is weak on something, if the person that's in your state is weak on something and they're leading in a certain way, it's best to call them and as the constituent that elected them and say, man, I really need to see you do better on this. I like that you're doing this, but this is not working. And this is actually really harmful to our leadership in this country and to this state and whatnot. So like using your voice well in the years in between to hold your elected officials accountable for, actual functioning and humane treatment of people and pathways, right? I think the second thing is, and we can end on this too, is just proximity. I think so many people think about this issue and they just look at numbers. But the closer you get to people, like you had mentioned earlier, Christine, it was just the closer you get to people, you actually start to hear their stories and you know their names, and you just start to realize like, wow, I I don't actually have a problem with this person. I don't actually have a problem. Like, okay, I'm supposed to get close so that I can make this issue personal. Like, I can't necessarily advocate well and use my voice well if everybody is this far away from me. But as soon as I get in closer proximity to people and I care enough about their personhood to affirm their dignity, not that I'm going to get closer so that I can like bestow dignity to them. Like the Lord has already done that in his creation of mankind. It's get close enough to affirm that dignity and then also make that person and their challenges personal to you. And that will also just help us use our voice well and give us things to say that are relevant and that actually become something that you can speak up with confidence about, right? There's so much we have this God-given compassion, and yet we don't have a lot of confidence to attach to it as far as how do I speak up about the issue? And really, you just take these nuggets that we know are true. Immigrants are made in the image and likeness of God. These things can coexist at the same time as far as safety and security and vetting and also humane treatment. Things like we want to thwart illegal activity, but also create flourishing and legal pathways. Like all these things Pick the thing that you feel confident in saying and just start saying that, because that curiosity will continue and that will be good for the health of the church and for the witness of our faith.
Yeah, yeah, that's really good, Bree. And I don't know, it just to make it, I guess, like more a little bit like more tangible and bite-sized for anybody who's watching.
Yeah.
I think about this in terms of like, let's say foster care, right? Like the foster care system, we know it's imperfect, we know it's broken, but when people step into that space to be a place of refuge, whether it's adoption or it's respite care, you go in knowing like I'm just stewarding what I have
In front of
for God's glory, you know, and so then it feels manageable. Like very few people, I mean, there are people, and you know them because you've worked in these spaces, who really are in the trenches trying to fix what's broken, trying to make better systems. But most of the people that I'm friends with, their involvement with foster care, CPS, adoption has just been like, okay, Lord, this is what I have. I just want to serve this well for your glory and for, again, like the dignity and the worth of the person in front of me. And so I think when you realize like there's a holy responsibility to just do what you can, don't worry about having to fix all of the systems and the borders. And because I can get lost in that too, like very quickly I can become so policy perspective focused that I miss the humanity and I miss the person in that. And then I miss what the Lord is asking me to do. And if people have the power and influence to change systems, then amen, go do that. But for the rest of us, like just it's a place of like how can I help? And if it is changing the way that we talk about people, which is so important, if it's donating, I don't want to like ever underestimate the power of like, you know, we give to Women of Welcome through World Relief, and then we give to other pro-life causes, because if this is important to us and I can't do it all, well, what can I do? You know, and so I think just reminding the Big C church that, you know, what can we do? Just do that and do it again with confidence. Do it for the glory of God. Do it because you love other people. You don't have to fix the rest because you can't. You can't. That's someone else's job and responsibility. So that it
you.
helps me to not get lost in the overwhelming
Yeah.
narratives.
And I think what I'd like to leave people with is just, this is a quote from Sheila Walsh, who this quote has stuck with me most of my life. But, when you're entering into this space, any complicated human dignity space, whether that's race relations or homelessness or prison issue, whatever it is, you're going to have people who do not understand why you're entering into this space. And I love this quote because she said, there are going to be people who do not understand what the love of Christ compels you to do. You should do it anyway, because
Yeah.
you really are only accountable to one person.
Yeah.
And so at the end of the day, Matthew 25 does tell us he's going to recognize us by how well we got in proximity to people and met them in their pain and served them in their pain. And as we have done unto those least of these, we've done unto him. And as we have not done unto him, and he will not recognize us. So it's just this call to say, you know what? Hold the curiosity and move forward as you can.
Yeah.
Is your compassion moving you anywhere? Is it creating in you a desire to be more like Christ? And that's the goal. That's the goal for all of us, to be more like Christ. So I'm so glad you went to the border with us. I'm so thankful for your friendship. And I'm so thankful for all of the things that you do. I think we could talk for another hour about all of the things that we're all involved in and all the wonderful work. So just wanted to thank you. And I appreciate you entering into this space with curiosity and compassion as well.
Well, thank you, Bree. Just want to leave this affirmation for you as well. I'm so humbled by the way that you show up every day, because I know that you get met with a lot of tension or you're misunderstood, and you keep doing it. And I know that the impetus, the catalyst for that is Jesus. That you're not doing it for any other reason, that it really is just, this is the holy mantle the Lord has given me, and I'm doing my best, and you're doing a great job. And your book is answering, anybody who would ask the question, like, well, why would I care? Why would I enter this space? And you
Yeah.
hold up your copy too. So it addresses the why, and it also, I'm only halfway through, but it's getting into the how. It's like how. So anyone who is like, well, why would I care about, immigrants and refugees? Your book answers that. Anyone who's asking, well, how can I show up and do that? You do that well too. So proud of you for showing up, staying in it, it matters.
Well, thanks, friend. Thank you very much. So great to see you. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Share along if you'd like. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.